Likely every one of us has witnessed something like this before. Whether you're a parent or not, whether it was with your own children, a niece, a nephew, or even seeing it from a distance among people you didn't even know. Likely every one of us at some time has watched a young child learning how to walk and take some steps towards the arms of a loved one. The adult has their arms open wide, reaching out for the little one. Often a smile is on their face as they watch that little one take each step. And often the child will hear words similar to, "Come to mommy, come to daddy, come to grandma, come to grandpa." They hear the words, "Come to me." Over our lives, we hear those words in different contexts, at different times, said by different people. Sometimes behind the words, there's a sense of celebration, like when perhaps a child in elementary school gets the best mark on a project that they've ever gotten. And with arms open wide and a smile on their face, mom or dad might say to them, "Come to me." When somebody graduates from high school or university, a friend might offer a hug. And even without saying any words, you know what those open arms mean. They mean, "Come to me." Other times, the words and gestures are offered more as words of comfort or consolation. Like when a young child is learning how to ride their bike and they fall and they skin their knee. Mom or dad will open their arms and say, "Come to me." When somebody's feeling lonely, when somebody's been laid off and is feeling discouraged, the open arms of a friend or a loved one can make a huge difference. You know what those arms are saying? They're saying, "Come to me." Earlier this week, as I was reflecting on our Old Testament reading today, and I was thinking about the context surrounding that passage, it was as though I could hear those words, "Come to me," over and over again. I'd like us to spend some time in that story from Genesis, and briefly in that passage we heard from Matthew's Jesus story. Those passages, our prayer is that in those passages we might hear God speak to us today. So we begin with the passage from the book of Genesis. The story itself was a story about the search for a bride for Isaac. But in order to really appreciate all that was going on, I think it's important for us to step back a little bit and to look at the context. In case you're not familiar with Isaac's story, let me just tell you a little bit about his background. Isaac's parents were Abraham and Sarah. Their story alone is an incredible one, in that Isaac was born to them when they were well past the normal age of having children. Now, their names formerly were Abram and Sarai. Now, back then, when people were married, they were expected to have children. If a couple had children, then it was thought as though God favored or blessed that couple. Well, Abram and Sarai, they longed to have children. And yet, by the age of 75 for Abraham and 66 for Sarai, they still had none. Now, Abram's own name was like rubbing salt in the wound. The name, the Hebrew name, Abram, translated, it meant exalted father. So every time he heard his name said, it reminded him of what he wasn't. And then God met with Abram and called him to leave the land of his ancestors and to go to a land that God would show to him. It was like God was saying to Abram, "Come to me." And with that call came a promise that he would become a father to many nations. And he was given the name Abraham, which meant father of many. There was hope for Abraham and Sarah. But still, things were not looking promising, particularly by the time Abraham was 89. Abraham was 98 and Sarah was 89. This is 23 years after the call. They still had no children. It almost felt to them as though God had abandoned them. I can imagine at times the two trying to console the heartbreak in the other, opening their arms to the other and saying, "Come to me." And yet, something happened. Sarah got pregnant. Isaac was their miracle child. And he was given the name Isaac, which meant laughter. In their golden years, God had given them laughter. Isaac was their only child. He was so precious to them. And as he grew up, there was a special bond between Isaac and his parents. Now, just before our passage today, Sarah died. I can just imagine Isaac's eyes filling with tears as he's told the news by his father. And I can imagine Abraham opening up his arms to his now full-grown son and saying, "Come to me." By this time, Isaac is 36 years old. And it's as though all of a sudden, Abraham suddenly realizes that after all that's been taken out of him through the death of his wife, Sarah, he won't be all that long following her. Remember, he was 9 years older than she was. And it dawns on Abraham that Isaac still isn't married. Now, back in those days, marriages, they were arranged by the parents. Not sure why Isaac's marriage hadn't been arranged yet. Maybe Abraham thought that Sarah was going to do it, or maybe when Sarah got sick, that all their time was consumed with her. I don't know. But for some reason, Isaac wasn't married at this point. Don't know whether it bothered Isaac, but it certainly bothered Abraham. After all, how was God going to fulfill the promise that Abraham would become the father of many nations if Isaac wasn't married and having children? So Abraham wanted to make sure before he died that Isaac would find a wife. But regardless of how desperate Abraham was to see his son get married, there was no way, as far as Abraham was concerned, that his son was just going to marry anybody. There was no way that his son was going to marry somebody in this new land that he was now living. No, he had to marry somebody from his old homeland, from among his own people. Now, Abraham was old himself. He couldn't go himself searching for a wife for Isaac. And it seems as though he's not prepared to trust Isaac. And I don't know whether it's because he thinks Isaac might stay or what might happen. Or he doesn't want Isaac just to leave his sight. I don't know. But for some reason, Abraham decides to send his chief servant with the instructions to find a wife for Isaac. What a mission it was for the servant of Abraham. What faithfulness towards Abraham and what faith in God did that servant carry with him as he embarked on the mission. Certainly things were not going to be easy for him. I mean, how was he going to find the one that God wanted for his master's son Isaac, when he'd never even met any of Abraham's people before? He was probably hoping that God might do something really dramatic to catch his attention. Likely he knew Abraham's story of how God just spoke to Abraham when he issued that calling. Maybe he hoped that God would do something similar. "Hey, servant, there is the woman right there." Well, as he approached the town, there was nothing extraordinary that happened to make it clear the one God had chosen. So rather than seeing something extraordinary from God, we see something extraordinary in the faith of Abraham's servant. Because just on the outskirts of town, near the place where where the people would come to draw water, the servant had a conversation with God. Yet to call it a conversation, I think is a little bit of a stretch, because it was far more one-sided than anything you would expect to call a conversation. Because the servant was the one who did all the talking. God seemingly was silent. Isn't that sometimes how it feels to us? That we're the ones doing the talking, and sometimes it seems as though we just don't hear anything back from God. The servant hears nothing, and yet decides to take a step of faith. He lays out a very specific prayer. Lord, when a woman comes to draw water, I'm going to ask her if she will give me some water. And if she says, yes, I'll give you some water, and I will give your camels some water too, then let that be the one who you've chosen. And as we see in verse 46 of our passage today, that exact phrase that the servant had used in his prayer to God, that was fulfilled in Rebekah. Because she said that in response to him. He asked her for water. She said, yes, I'll get you some water. And let me get some water for your camels as well. At that moment, I wouldn't be surprised if the servant just closed his eyes, giving thanks to God. And probably in the back of his mind, he could hear his master Abraham say, the mission is completed. Now come to me. Well, as the story continues, the servant meets Rebekah's family and tells them the whole story of what unfolded out near the well, telling them that he wants to take Rebekah back to his master's son, Isaac, that she might become his wife. Now, I probably don't need to remind you that back in those days, marriages were more like business transactions. Women really didn't have any say in the matter. If a family thought that a future son-in-law was suitable, if a family thought a future son-in-law's family was suitable, arrangements would be made for their daughter to become the new bride. It was almost as though women were considered part of the family's property, to be bartered with at will. Now, today's reading skipped some parts of Genesis 24. And some of that which we skipped really would have conveyed a sense of Rebekah being property, because the negotiations with the servant were just made with her family. In verse 51, Rebekah's brother and dad, they say this, "Here is Rebekah, take her and go, and let her become the wife of your master's son." It seems as though everything is arranged. The servant likely felt as though everything was falling into place. And then, from Rebekah's family, it's almost as though there was a sense of, hey, hold on a minute. Maybe we're making this decision a little bit too quickly. I can imagine the servant, whether it showed on his face or not, feeling a sense of dread to come over him. Was the mission going to fail? Was the deal going to fall through? Would Rebekah not be going back home with him? It seems as though Rebekah's family were starting to second guess the whole thing. So notice what they do. They do something that would have been unheard of in that day and age. They decide to hand the decision over to Rebekah. I can just imagine Rebekah's mother saying to Rebekah, "Come to me." And then whispering into her ear, "Will you go with this man?" All of a sudden, the choice was hers. She didn't have to go. She was under no obligation whatsoever. And yet, listen to her response. In verse 48, she says, "I will go. And as we heard in verses 59 and 60 today, it then says, so they sent Rebekah on her way. And they blessed Rebekah and said to her, our sister, may you increase to thousands upon thousands. As I think about the journey Rebekah made toward her new homeland and all that awaited her there, I wonder what Rebekah might have been thinking as the camel on which she was riding took each successive step. Was she feeling excited and hopeful? Or was there apprehension and fear within her? Did she have questions as to how everything might unfold? I mean, she was pretty well leaving everything behind because God had called her forward. And yet I don't think we can take it for granted that because God was a part of all this, that it would have been easy for Rebekah, because their possibility exists that at this point Rebekah didn't even know God. I think sometimes we assume that when Abraham was called by God to leave his homeland, he had had a pre-existing relationship with God. But the scriptures don't tell us that, and scholars wonder whether that was really even the case, that perhaps when he was called by God, that was actually his first encounter with God. And if it was the first encounter, it's quite possible that his own people, those that he left behind in his old homeland, they hadn't met with God prior to Abraham leaving. And if that was the case, the likelihood would have been that Rebekah wouldn't have known God when she went to go and get water that day. Sure, by the time she had met with the servant, she had heard about his prayer and the explanation of about how it all unfolded. But that may have been the first time that she'd heard of the God of Abraham. So when she was traveling towards Abraham and Isaac, was it merely about going to those two men into that new homeland? Or was there really something more? Perhaps something even unknown to her at the time. I believe there was much more of a call. It wasn't just Isaac or Abraham saying, "Come to me." Those words were coming from God. Her choice to go would prove to be the beginning of something significant for Rebekah. In time, Rebekah would come to know God. In time, Rebekah would come to have a relationship with God. What a step in faith made by the servant in his prayer. What a step in faith made by Rebekah. Makes me wonder what step in faith God is laying before you and me today. Perhaps that could serve as a question to reflect on this week. What step of faith might God be laying before you? In what way might God be saying to you, "Come to me"? You know, there may well be people who are watching and listening to this right now who are thinking, "I'm not even sure I've got the energy to be thinking about taking some great step of faith." There may be people watching and listening today who are thinking right now, "I am spent. I've got nothing left." The very thought of taking on some new challenge from God could leave you feeling exhausted. Let me just say, I think God is okay with that. God knows exactly where we are, how we're feeling. He knows all the stuff we're going through and all that's going on within us. Let's be honest. The past few months have been very draining. As much as people may feel as though they've navigated well through what this pandemic has forced upon us, it hasn't been without it taking a toll. In the past 4 months, they've been tough on people. Healthcare workers have had to work extra hours. Other essential workers have had so much asked of them. Teachers have had to learn how to teach in ways they were never taught before. Students had to navigate new ways of learning. The adjustments haven't been easy. People have lost their jobs. Others have experienced increased stress and fear about losing jobs, or about fear about catching the virus, or concern of the health of loved ones. Church hasn't been the same. Sure, it's been good to be able to live stream, but it's not the same. We miss each other. We miss communion each week. For many of us, the past 4 months have been exhausting. I know I found it tiring. I'm not sure I'm necessarily working harder, but I certainly find it taking more energy from me. For many of us, the thought of taking some great step of faith like Rebecca, it can feel overwhelming. So perhaps it's the words of our gospel reading this morning that are for you. Jesus said these words, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." Notice Jesus doesn't say, just take it easy. He doesn't just say, just stop what you're doing. Doesn't say, just take a well-deserved vacation. I mean, all those things, those are great things to do. But that's not what Jesus is saying here. Jesus is saying, come to me. Jesus is saying, take a step closer to me. Rest in me. Allow my arms to enfold you. Allow me to take the burden from you. He's saying, draw your energy from me. Receive comfort from me. He's saying, come to me. I think that leads each of us to ask ourselves this question today. To what extent is my weariness related to the fact that I haven't been going to Jesus as much as he might be calling me? So perhaps that is the step of faith for you today. Simply taking a step towards Jesus. To lean on him, to rest in him, to hand your burden over to him, and not to pick up that burden from him once again, but to leave it with him. Perhaps that's a step of faith for you today. Or maybe there's more to the call. Perhaps the call is more like the one faced by Rebecca. I believe each one of us needs to consider the question, what is Jesus saying to me today? Whatever the call, I believe something we see in Rebecca's story speaks to each and every one of us today. In that story, I was struck by Isaac's response when he met Rebecca. Did you notice what it said? Verse 67, Isaac brought her into the tent of his mother Sarah, and he married Rebecca. So she became his wife, and he loved her. Notice those last 4 words, and he loved her. That wasn't expected to be part of the deal back then. It wasn't about love, it was about heirs. But as Rebecca responded to the invitation, so did she receive Isaac's love, a gift of grace poured out by God on Rebecca. And you know, I believe that the love that Isaac had for Rebecca pales in comparison to the love that God has for you and for me. God once said, I have loved you with an everlasting love. That's what God's love is like for you and for me. And whether our step is a huge one or whether our step is simply turning towards Jesus because we have no more energy in ourselves, either way, God responds in love towards us. So what is it for you today? With whom do you identify? Perhaps you identify with Abraham's servant, wishing God would speak directly regarding something you're dealing with. Perhaps you identify more with Rebekah, and hearing a call and not knowing where the call will lead you. Or perhaps you see yourself more in the crowd around Jesus, feeling weary and heavy laden. Wherever you are, and whatever it is you're going through, Jesus is with you. And his arms, they're open wide. And his words are clear as he's saying, come to me. Let's bow our heads. Heavenly Father, we thank you for your love for us. We thank you for all your blessings to us. We thank you for the way in which you were in that story as that servant looked for a wife for Isaac. We thank you that you spoke through Jesus about coming to him when we're weary and heavy laden. Lord, we just pray that you'll be with us in whatever step it is that you are calling us to make, whether it's a step of faith, whether it's to just lay our burden before you. We just pray that you will give us the confidence to take that step, to come to you, and to receive whatever it is you have for us. We ask these things in the precious name of Jesus. Amen.